as Jennifer mentioned, the stories in City and Colour are about the early Victoria history. I'm going to be introducing you to what I thought of as a very unusual group to have come to this to Victoria, and I'll be introducing you to about 4 individuals that I think are really, really interesting. The stories in City and Colour are about the diverse immigrants of Victoria. When I first moved here, about 45 years ago, it was very different from the culturally, linguistically, and ethnically diverse Montreal where I was born and raised. But when I started researching, I found that this wasn't always so. Now, a word of warning, I have used some historical quotes, and they may include words that may be offensive or uncomfortable to hear. But these were in the language of the day. So the first recorded non-Indigenous, non-British person to have sailed around Vancouver Island was an apocryphal Greek. His name was Ioannis Apostolos Phocas Valerianos, quite the moniker. In 1592, the King of Spain hired him to find the coveted Straits of Anian, and his shipmates renamed him Juan de Fuca. Now we know that Métis people of mixed Indigenous and European DNA, were early explorers. And it's quite rare to find stories about female pioneers, let alone women of color. But I found stories about 3 Métis matriarchs. Amelia Connolly Douglas became British Columbia's First Lady. Josette Lagacé Work was the very first woman to be commended by the BC legislature for her good works and for being the oldest person in the colony when she died in 1896. Isabella Marilia Mainville Ross was the first woman to purchase land in the colony of Vancouver Island. Now, of all the peoples that I researched and wrote about, I was most surprised at how many Hawaiians, then known as Kanakas, who came to the colony of Vancouver Island. I was really delighted to learn that the very first recorded young woman from Hawaii, her name was Winnie, and she came in 1787. I'll be telling you more about the Hawaiians and why they came and what they did here in the Pacific Northwest. Now, the Fraser River Gold Rush in 1858 brought not only gold seekers, but several groups of note. There were Jews, like Amelia Copperman. She's the first registered female merchant about whom I'll be talking to you about. Samuel Davies Schultz became not only Canada's very first Jewish judge, but I thought of him as a Renaissance man because he was a baseball player, a writer, a playwright. He wrote songs. He was just an amazing person. The Congregation Emmanuel Synagogue is Canada's oldest original existing synagogue, and it was completed in 1863. It also brought American blacks. A large contingent of American blacks came from California for the main purpose of settling here in the colony, because in 1858, California itself was considering becoming a slave state. Now, during Black History Month, you've likely heard of Charles and Nancy Alexander, who settled in Saanich, or Sylvia Estes Stark, who was a former slave whose family farmed on Salt Spring Island. And I'll be telling you about Grafton Tyler Brown, the American black artist who held Victoria's very first art exhibition. Now, Chinese businessmen also came during the gold rush, but many had learned that catering to the needs of miners was a steadier and more lucrative way to make a living. Later, tens of thousands of Chinese were hired to complete the Transcontinental Railroad here in British Columbia, but when it was completed in 1885, governments tried to limit Chinese immigration by imposing a head tax and other laws. 2 years ago, we commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, better known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, Victoria-born Lim Bang experienced school segregation here in the city as a child and fought discrimination for much of his life. Victoria Toi Mei Chung became Canada's first Chinese doctor, but in order to get her degree in medicine, she had to go to the University of Toronto because British Columbia would not allow Chinese students. And she became a heroine in China because she spent the rest of her life practicing there. And I'll tell you the story about Chan Dun, who was a patriotic and philanthropic businessman. Now, the first recorded Japanese immigrant was purported to be Manzo Nagano. He has a mountain named in his honor by River's Inlet, but was he really the first? No, we know that now. The story about Esquimaut's Japanese gardens and tea house tells of the Japanese presence here before World War II. And I'll tell you more about Isaburo Kishida, the man who designed Victoria's very first Japanese gardens. Kanaka Row, Kanaka Creek, and Kanaka Bluff. These are names seen around British Columbia. And as you might have guessed, they're Hawaiian in origin. Kanaka is a Polynesian word meaning person or human being, but now is probably more considered to be a derogatory term, so we'll try not to use it too much. Hawaiian Islanders actually played a largely unknown but extremely significant role in the settlement of the whole Pacific Northwest. And this is the story about why and how they came. So a little bit of background. Captain James Cook was purportedly the first European to land on the Hawaiian Islands in 1778. After provisioning his ship, he continued on his trip to the North American continent, with orders to find, again, the Straits of Anyan, what we know as the coveted Northwest Passage. He never did find it, but he did find Vancouver Island. And during his month-long stay here, Cook traded with the local indigenous peoples for sea otter pelts in exchange for what he, and probably we, considered trivial items, such as copper, knives, fish hooks, and glass beads, but they were very useful for them. He immediately recognized the potential of the fur trade on this coast. Captain Cook returned to Hawaii in 1779 and was killed on the Big Island of Hawaii. But his journals and his charts from that last voyage made it safely back to England, and the information about his discoveries caused a sensation. It launched an international rivalry for the Pacific Northwest sea otter trade with China. Within 10 years of his discovery, the Hawaiian Islands became a regular midpoint wintering, watering, and refueling spot for European and American ships, including those of the Hudson's Bay Company, commonly known as the HBC. Now, in 1829, the HBC established a trading post and hiring agency in Honolulu, which was in operation for 30 years. By 1845, there were 119 Hawaiians living at the Hudson's Bay headquarters, which was in Fort Vancouver at the time, now Washington State. They comprised the single non-Indigenous, non-white ethnic group in the area, and they represented over 50% of the worker rosters. There were Hawaiians working in every post along the whole Pacific Northwest. At Fort Vancouver, the place where the workers lived became known as Kanaka Village. So what did they do there? Why did they come? They were known as good sailors, they were hard workers, dependable, and they also wanted to experience life away from the islands, if you can believe that. So what did they do? So of course they helped establish new trading posts, and they went on hunting and trapping expeditions. And you also have to realize that the settlements were working farms. They grew their own produce, they raised animals, they had cows, pigs, chickens, and there were all these trees around them. All those tall Douglas firs were used to start a very large lumber operation. And the lumber that was derived from those Douglas firs were exported to Hawaii, where they were starting to build European-style houses, including shingles. But it was also used to build this edifice. The Kauai'ahau Church in Honolulu. This was known as the Westminster Abbey of Hawaii. This was where royalty were once baptized, crowned, married, and buried. And Hawaii also became a major market for the flour from the gristmill, from all of the fields that were planted, and from the cheese and butter that were produced there. But the most important export from Fort Vancouver was salmon, which had been introduced to the Hawaiians as early as 1830. Between 1830 and 1858, the Hudson's Bay Company was the main purveyor of salmon to Hawaii. And it was because it was featured in this popular Hawaiian dish called lomi lomi. And it's a food item that's served at luau's to this very day. The fish were caught by the indigenous peoples, but the rest of the work, like gutting, pickling, and barrel making, were mostly done by the Hawaiians at the fort. At its peak, in 1849, Hawaii imported over 4,600 barrels of fish, each weighing 180 pounds. They really liked that salmon. Now, coming through Hawaii were commodities from China, Malaysia, and the Caribbean islands. In addition, there was island produce, fruit and staples, such as salt and sugar. But salt was of primary importance because it was not only used in seasoning, but it was also used to preserve that beautiful salmon, the beef, the pork, and the butter. The island of Oahu had a natural source of crystallized salt from a crater lake located close to Honolulu. And after 1829, Hawaii actually replaced England as the source of salt. So when the HBC moved its headquarters to Victoria in 1849, Hawaiians helped build the fort, and we had our own Kanaka Row. It's where the Empress Hotel now stands. Emily Carr wrote about it in the Book of Small. In 1859, the Hawaiian government even opened a consulate here. Now, many Hawaiians returned after their contracts. They returned to Hawaii after their contracts were up. But some also stayed because they had started families with local indigenous ladies. The smaller islands around Vancouver Island, such as Salt Spring Island, felt more like home to Hawaiians. There, they were free to do as they wish. They were able to preempt land from the government and grow their own food. And many returned to the subsistence living that they had done in Hawaii, harvesting the bounty of the sea. Now, did you know that Hawaii came this close to becoming a protectorate of the British Commonwealth in 1794? Now imagine how much cheaper it would be for us to be vacationing in Hawaii if that were the case. But instead, the US, despite signing an international agreement in 1849 recognizing Hawaii's sovereignty, reversed its position and annexed the islands in 1898. Judge Pemberton said he believed Amelia Copperman is a scandalous, perjured old woman, utterly untrustworthy. But Amelia Copperman was a woman ahead of her time, a successful businesswoman who made it on her own in a man's world. Courageous? Before she came to Victoria with her husband William in 1858, Amelia had already escaped the anti-Jewish pogroms in Prussia and had survived the near sinking of the rotting SS Commodore that was to have brought them from California. Notorious? Undoubtedly. As attested to by the number of newspaper articles which often made fun of her many public disputes on both sides of the law. But these newspapers have given us a look into the personal life of this brash, pioneer businesswoman. Feisty? She never gave up. Not when thieves stole her stuff, nor when she was threatened at knife point. She had a fierce temper and never hesitated to talk back or even fight when challenged. Now, both Amelia and William Copperman were skilled business people. When they lost their belongings on the SS Commodore, it didn't take them long to replace the goods and set sail again. In Victoria, they made it through that first harsh winter, and like most newcomers to Victoria during the gold rush, they spent their first few months in a tent, but soon built a shack that served as both a trading post and home on Store Street. They sold basic foods and other goods to miners and also traded with local farmers. But their continuing success eventually came from bartering for furs with the local indigenous peoples. Some who came from the North Coast had ever only traded with Hudson's Bay Company, and it was all because of Amelia. By 1860, the Coppermans had moved to a larger space on Johnson Street, in the heart of the business district. The area was a target for thieves. The couple had witnessed and survived the lawlessness of Gold Rush California and had learned how to protect themselves and pursue justice, sometimes by chasing the thieves themselves or going through the courts. When the Victoria Trade Licenses Act came into effect in 1861, William was registered as an Indian trader, and after only 3 years in operation, their business was valued at £1,000. The couple built 2 new houses and advertised for tenants, often renting to Indigenous peoples. Amelia showed a rare compassion for Indigenous peoples. Even when they betrayed her trust by stealing from her, she would not pursue charges. They were her customers, her tenants, and her friends. Hers was an attitude not necessarily shared by the general population. However, she never backed down when confronting non-Indigenous opponents. As a woman of means, she wore silk dresses and she wore expensive jewelry. And for a brief time, when William joined the congregation of the newly built Temple Emmanuel in 1863, she could have been included in the newly formed Victoria Hebrew Ladies Benevolent Society. The husbands of the Hebrew ladies were successful businessmen who knew the Coppermans, but her name was never connected with this distinguished group. On the contrary, she was probably shunned by them. More likely, she would have been seen to be different. A non-traditional woman who worked outside the home and who drew unwanted attention to herself. Added to her disgrace was the fact that she was discarded by her husband. Now, instead of a private separation agreement worked out between the synagogue's elders, their divorce proceedings, like their business conflicts, became a spectacle recorded in newspaper and shared in every whispered conversation. During their divorce, the couple had a dispute over some valuable possessions that were locked up in an armoire in their bedroom. Amelia refused William's access to the bedroom, and even though he offered to buy them from her, she said no. Instead, she sued him, accusing him of having gotten them illegally. And when he tried to take them from her, she fought back, screaming and writhing on the floor, and a doctor and a policeman had to be called. When the doctor found out why this fit had taken place, and it was about the struggle for these possessions, he demanded that they be retained by Amelia, and she immediately became calm and quiet. In court, Amelia could turn on the charm. All dressed up in fancy clothes, she would make a grand entrance and say hello to the lawyers on either side of the courtroom. And she would curtsy and offer her gloved hand. She was shamelessly audacious. She was a living personification of chutzpah. Now, in the end, William was found not guilty. He also got his get, his Jewish divorce, and he went back to Germany and found a new and fecund wife. But Amelia also got what she wanted. She took the monetary settlement as well as the get, and she got the business. In 1 year on her own, Amelia built up the business from the value of £1,000 to £5,000. She was listed under the Victoria Trade Licenses Act as an Indian trader, the first woman to be so registered. And all this despite not being able to read or write in English. That's her signature, the X. Amelia was about 40 years old when she got divorced, and although the get allowed her to remarry, she stayed single for the rest of her life. But life as a rich woman on her own is full of danger. There were still rumors about hidden treasures in her bedroom, and an attempted burglary at her house went terribly wrong. It resulted in the accidental shooting death of a policeman by another policeman. And although she was not directly involved, this incident would haunt her for the rest of her life. Now, the economy of British Columbia was at its lowest point in 1867, and the Indian trading post was only valued at $600, a significant devaluation from just a few years ago. Now, the loss of her personal savings added to her growing concerns as a business person, as a single woman, and an object of public ridicule. She continued to appear in court frequently, both in front of the aforementioned Judge Pemberton, both as an accuser and an accused, building her reputation of questionable character, but she never backed down. Her final years in Victoria were difficult. In 1876, Amelia Copperman died alone in Sitka, Alaska, while attending a wedding. She was not yet 60 years old. The news filtered back to Victoria, and Amelia's notorious past, her divorce, her business, her wealth, and the accidental killing of a policeman were raked up one last time. Now, I've included a few enigmas in this book, and this is one of those stories. Grafton Tyler Brown's first art exhibition was as a white man in BC, but now has been reclaimed as California's first successful Black artist. He was born on February 22, 1841, to freed slaves Thomas and Wilhelmina Brown in Pennsylvania. Brown was originally registered as Black, but he had his father's pale complexion, and he was identified in subsequent census documents as colored, mulatto, indicating one Black parent, then quadroon, indicating one Black grandparent, and finally, white. At age 17, he followed the Oregon Trail west to California and worked as a hotel porter in Sacramento. And while there, his paintings caught the attention and admiration of the Sacramento Union newspaper. He found work eventually as an artist with a well-known lithographer named Charles Kuchar in San Francisco. Brown's John was to draw everyday items like bank checks, diplomas, and what became known as his most popular works, bird's eye views of mining towns. When Kuchar died, Brown bought the business, renamed it Grafton T. Brown & Co., and gained considerable success. He specialized in printing maps, stock certificates, letterhead, and invoices. And you might recognize some of his clients, which are still in business today. Names such as Ghirardelli Chocolate Company, Levi Strauss & Company. And one of his Canadian clients was John Sullivan Dees, the American Black tinsmith who owned BC's first salmon cannery on Dees Island. So Amos Bowman, who was a Canadian surveyor, whom Brown met in San Francisco, invited him on a geological survey of the Cascade Mountains of British Columbia as a draftsman. Brown later settled in Victoria to work as a full-time landscape artist. He had a studio in the Occidental Hotel, which was located at the corner of Store and Johnson Street. And while there, he painted 22 views of Victoria and its surroundings. Remember, 22. Using these paintings for his inaugural show, Grafton Tyler Brown was to be British Columbia's first professional artist to hold an exhibition. The show was open on June 25th, 1883. It ran for 1 week, and it was held at the British Colonist newspaper's new building on Government Street. A reviewer praised Brown, our local artist, for his detailed and realistic works of refined art. The second exhibition in Victoria, The Mystery of Grafton Tyler Brown, Race, Art, and Landscape in 19th Century British Columbia, was held in 2017. One of the mysteries was how, as a black man, he had been able to pass as a white man at the time. The second mystery is that few of those 22 paintings from his inaugural exhibition have ever been found. One of those paintings hangs in Craigdarroch Castle, and that's what you see here. In 2016, another painting, Castle Geyser, Yellowstone National Park, not part of the 22, sold at a Dallas auction for over $81,000 US. So this is his signature. What might you find in your attic or garage? 16-year-old Chan Dun came to Victoria from China in 1893. He would have paid a $50 head tax. His interests were wide-ranging and included business, musical instruments and music, and politics, both in his home and adopted countries. His entrepreneurial career started in 1900 as a silent partner in a grocery business. Partnerships was one way to raise capital, as few, if any, banks would loan money to a Chinese individual. So over the next decade or so, he and various partners operated a series of cafes around the Chinatown area, catering to working-class men. These included the Montreal, the White, and the Tourist. But by 1917, Chan Dun had saved enough money to buy the Panama Hotel Restaurant, which was located at 536 Johnson Street. He did this on his own. He changed the name to the Panama Cafe, but the business languished, and perhaps because of its location, because the hotel above was well known as a brothel. In 1930, he bought the empty three-story building in 1407 Government Street. It was once a theater where lavish Chinese operas were performed. The Panama Cafe was relocated on the ground floor and became a popular and long-lasting dining spot. It remained a family-run business until 1967, a decade after Chan Dun passed away. The restaurant's success lay in the fact that it provided affordable meals for working-class people. During the Depression, the cafe honored food coupons and served a full three-course meal for just 25 cents. Chan Dun followed the news about his home country and likely attended the 1911 Victoria Rally with Dr. Sun Yat-sen. The Chinese nationalist leader was here raising funds for a revolution against the Qing dynasty. The Qing was overthrown in 1912, and while China was nominally a republic until 1949, the political situation in China remained in turmoil and chaos. In China, supporters of the republic had formed the Chinese Nationalist League, known as the CNL. In 1922, Chan Dun was approached by the CNL to establish a school to train pilots to fly for the Chinese Air Force. He and a partner founded the Victoria Chinese Aviation School. They hired Lieutenant William Henry Brown, a decorated World War I pilot who operated a training school at Lansdowne Field, and this is at Lansdowne Field, where Lansdowne Middle School now stands. Harry, as he was known, provided a trainer biplane with pontoons so the Chinese students could train at Esquimalt Harbor. At first, 8 young men were initially recruited for training, with another 2 joining at a later date. After completing their theoretical work, each student trained in the air. After a year, they had all logged over 9,000 kilometers during 750 flights, all accident-free. You know what's coming, right? In 1923, their first soloist completed a perfect 15-minute flight. And then their most promising student accidentally crashed into the harbor, destroying the aircraft. The student, luckily, escaped with only minor injuries. However, this spelled the end of the Victoria Chinese Aviation School, and perhaps the dreams of all of those aspiring pilots. Now, a counter-espionage unit of the RCMP had kept the school under surveillance, as they had correctly suspected that the school was involved with the Chinese Nationalist League. Chan Dun and his wife, Ku Ching Lim, had 12 children. As the children grew, they each helped out in the restaurant after school. And to relax, the family played music. Each child played at least one instrument. Steve and Paul the drums, Philip the violin, Alan the piano, Roy the trumpet and the French horn, and Ira, Can, and Herbie the saxophone. All four girls, Esther, Mabel, Gladys, and Dorcas, played piano. Music was entertainment, relaxation, and a gift that the family shared with the community. As young adults, the kids would perform weekend gigs at Terry's Drugstore, a popular teen hangout. 6 of the boys played with Al Price and the Mandarins, and later joined saxophonist Bill Johnston to form the Celestial Gents Big Band. Their last gig, they performed in Victoria and Vancouver for little or no money. Their last gig was at Crystal Gardens here in the fall of 1942, when the war interrupted everybody's lives. Chan Dun and his family showed their patriotism to Canada as well. During World War II, Ira and Paul served with the Royal Canadian Engineers in India. Herbie had to go to Manitoba to join the Royal Canadian Air Force because BC wouldn't accept Chinese recruits. Roy received the Military Medal for Bravery as a volunteer working behind enemy lines in Burma in a top-secret mission that was coordinated by the SOE, the British Special Operations Executive. Isaburo Kishida has left an amazing legacy of gardens for this area and is the main man and person responsible for developing all these Japanese gardens on the West Coast. And of course has now influenced a lot of other Japanese-style gardens throughout North America. Paul Allison, Supervisor of Gardens and Grounds, Royal Roads University. Now, Isaburo Kishida did not know he would be such a trendsetter when he boarded the SS Tartar in the spring of 1907 to sail from Japan to British Columbia. It was not going to be an easy sailing, as his ticket was for third-class steerage, below decks where Asian passengers were forced to travel, and the ocean voyage would take almost a month. He was already 65 years old, but he was curious about a letter that his son had sent, requesting his help in designing and building a traditional Japanese garden and tea house in a remote place named after the British Queen, Victoria. As a professional garden designer for the Yokohama Nursery Company, he was a master of creating spaces that were restful, spiritual, and beautiful to behold. Isaburo and his son, Yoshitaro or Joe Kishida, had told him about the location of the garden. The property he had leased for the new business was located next door to a popular attraction called the Tramway Gorge Park, opened recently in 1905 in Esquimalt. There was a new electric car which offered affordable transportation directly from downtown Victoria to the park and could bring 100 people every 20 minutes. Ready-made clientele. The park offered live entertainment as well as picnic tables and food stalls. People also came to swim in the gorge waterway. It was much cleaner in those days. The business plan was simple. Draw clients in with a new attraction, provide food and refreshments in a unique setting, and offer good services and dining options. Within a few months, Joe and his friend and main business partner, Hayato, or Harry Takata, had raised $5,000. Isaburo landed in Victoria on April 19th, ordering all his supplies, including trees and shrubs, stone ornaments, paper lanterns, bamboo furniture, and tea sets from Japan. Work progressed quickly, and the Japanese Tea House and Gardens was opened on Thursday, July 11th, 1907. On the first day, almost 800 customers attended, and by the weekend, thousands had come. It was an instant success. In fact, the investors would get their money back within 2 years. Later, a small zoo, a maze, games, and a miniature bonsai garden were added, which was a bonus for families with children. Now, one key person who was impressed with the immediate success of the gardens was Frank S. Barnard, whose company owned Tramway Gorge Park. He and his wife lived at Clovelly, a house overlooking Esquimalt Harbor, and he hired Isaburo Kushida to design a Japanese garden for his home. When it was completed, Frank held a party, where two of his guests, Jenny Bouchard and James Dunsmuir, decided that they too must have a Japanese garden. Now, Mrs. Jenny Bouchard, who was a chemist who worked for her husband's cement company, enjoyed gardening as well and had started to plant a garden where the current Japanese garden exists. After attending the party at Clovelly, and she saw what had been achieved there, she hired Isaburo Kushida to help her complete her own vision. And this entrance, you can see the tiny little red gates there. This entrance is the original one through the red Torii gate, flanked by those two towering purple beech trees. The beeches with their magnificent roots, the shaped yew tree, and the Japanese maple at the head of the stairs are the oldest non-native plants in the garden, all originally ordered from the Yokohama nursery. Now, James Dunsmuir was the richest man in British Columbia when he retired as the province's lieutenant governor in 1909. He built his retirement home, a small 15-room mansion he called Hatley Park, on the Esquimalt Lagoon. Isaburo Kushida created the first of Hatley Park's three main gardens around 1908-1909, now referred to as the Upper Japanese Garden. The water features include a lake to one side and streams that bisect the garden. Old flowering cherry and Japanese maple trees from Yokohama nurseries still bloom today. And you can see what it was like when it was first built and then just a few years ago. Joe Kushida returned to Japan in the early 1920s. He sold his interest in the gardens to Kensuke Takata, Harry's younger brother. Together, the two brothers and Kensuke's family ran the gardens for over 30 years. In 1942, the Takata family had to abandon their home and gardens and business. The men and the women were separated, and they were interned in BC's interior. The park and their home was vandalized. After the Second World War, the Takata family moved to Ontario and never came back here to live. Sadly, neither the original Japanese garden and tea house at Gorge Road, nor the one at Clovelly exist today. Isaburo Kushida was in Victoria for only 5 years before he returned to his homeland, but he left a lasting legacy. His visions of Japanese harmony, beauty, and peace within a Western setting at both Bouchard Gardens and Hatley Park. Happily, since the release of this book, a Takata family member descendant has returned to live in British Columbia and was involved with the revival of the Japanese gardens at Esquimalt Gorge Park. On site is the new Gorge Park Pavilion, which features Japanese-inspired architecture. And there is also a stone commemorating the Takata family and the original Japanese gardens. Now, we know that our communities, like the rest of the world, has had its ups and downs in terms of acceptance of diversity. We are all participants in witnessing and making history, and we each can make a difference. And I hope that my book can make a difference. Long may we strive as a community to be a beacon of civility, an oasis of active goodwill with a diverse population, living in peaceable and willing acceptance of one another. Thank you for your attention. I'll try and answer any questions that you have. If not, there are books for sale. Both this one and the book about my parents who had to come here and pay the $500 head tax. Yes?
Are there any people alive today who trace their ancestors to the Hawaiians.
Yes. Yes, there's a whole community that I know of in on Salt Spring Island who one of the names is Roland, and if you go to the Salt Spring archives, historical archives, they will have pictures and stories about the Hawaiians. And in fact, this is how over dinner, somebody asked me, how did I start this? And I started by going to the archives in RBCM. And the first story I found was about this this Hawaiian family who found out that they were descended all the way from Hawaii. They didn't know that. And they actually went back to Hawaii, got connected with all of these long-lost relatives, and there's still people going back and forth who, yeah. So from Hawaii to Salt Spring Island. Pretty cool. Yes?
Were the original settlers in Chinatown, were they mainly Cantonese or Mandarin speakers?
They would have been Cantonese speakers because most of the Chinese by then used to come from the south, close to the coast, and so Mandarin didn't come about until 1949 as the national language because it was the communists who brought it in. Yeah.
In your book, you have a favorite, and who is it?
I love Amelia Copperman, and I also thought very highly of the judge because he was such an accomplished man. But, you know, Victoria Chung has a wonderful history, a story as well. And yeah, I think those two, because they're characters. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much for having me come and speak to you today. It was my honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you.